This is one of my Acteas, and it blooms very late in the fall. Such an interesting plant. It makes these bottle brush heads, and it opens the flowers from the tip and works its way down. So on these smaller ones, the flowers are open perfectly right here. The tip is already finished. This is the older flower stem, and these flowers are all finished. And the ground is covered in the little white flowers. These are great plants. They take a little bit of time to get established in the garden. They do like a bit of shade and a bit of moisture, but they're pretty easy growing. In this video, I'm going to take you around the garden and show you some other things that I do at this time of the year. It's early October. The leaves are just starting to fall around here, but there's still chores for you to do in the garden. Let's talk about lawns. Should you fertilize those in the spring, midsummer, fall, maybe late winter? People have different opinions about what you should do. But when I have questions like that, I like to go back and understand the plants, understand the science. All of the lawn grasses we grow are cool growers. So they start growing in spring. They pretty much slow down in summer because it's too hot for them. And then they start growing again in fall. So if you think about that, it makes sense to fertilize when the plants are growing, especially for nitrogen, because nitrogen does not hang around very long in the soil. So we want to put nitrogen on the lawn in spring and in fall. And in fact, you really want to put it on like late September in zone 5, a little later in warmer climates, because we want to wait until these plants are growing. Then we want to lay down the nitrogen, because the plants need nitrogen and they'll gobble it up right away and use it. Now the other thing that's important is to also understand what the roots are doing, not just the green stuff on the top. Well, it turns out that roots grow the same way, and this is roots of most plants. They like to grow when it's cool. If it gets too warm, they stop growing. So the roots of this grass are growing in spring. It's warm enough, but not too hot yet. They don't grow well in summer. They grow again in fall, particularly early fall. And then they will stop when the temperature gets a little bit above freezing. Then the roots stop. So there's no point in fertilizing too late in the fall because the ground gets too cold. We get a freeze and the roots stop. So the best time to fertilize is mid-September to early October is perfect in this climate. Now the other thing that a lot of people do is they put down about 1/3 of their fertilizer in the fall and 2/3 in the spring. So early fall, right now, it's time to fertilize the lawn. When I'm fertilizing the lawn, I only put on the nitrogen. The P and K is already in the soil. I don't need to add more. So I use urea, which is a 4500. Now there's a problem with that. Two problems really. One is it's a lot of nitrogen and you can very easily burn your lawn. So you have to be very careful how much you put on. The other problem is that urea vaporizes. It turns into a gas and goes into the air, so it's lost very easily. So when you use urea, you want to do one of two things. One is you want to dig it into the soil, which of course you can't do on a lawn, but you could do that in your vegetable bed. The second way is to put it on and water it in. So what I do is I keep an eye on the weather, and when I know that we're going to get a good heavy rain, I fertilize the day before. The urea dissolves in the rain washes it into the soil, and I eliminate that evaporation problem. The benefit of urea is that it only is nitrogen, it doesn't have the other components, and it's the cheapest way to buy nitrogen for your lawn. I plant quite a few things in the fall, and here's an example. This is a very rare aconitum, and I put it in here a couple weeks ago. And as you can see, my flock of pink flamingos are guarding it to make sure nothing damages the plant. But there's still a job for me to do. Even though it's fall and we get a fair amount of rain, I keep an eye on these plants. You have to keep them watered right up until the ground freezes. That way they develop a really good root system. And as you now know, roots grow best in the fall. So I've got a couple months here for the roots to develop. I need to keep them watered. And if I do that, by next spring I'll have a very healthy plant. Here's another plant that was recently put in the ground. It's a really beautiful allium. Alliums are ornamental onions. This one is called Ozawa, and it is one of the last blooming plants in my garden. It's covered in bees right now, and it will bloom right up until frost. Now you'll see a couple things here. One is that there's a tag there, and the other one is my pot. And this is a habit I've gotten into. When I plant things, I usually leave the pot where I planted them. And the reason for that is it tells me that there's something planted there recently. So when I'm walking around the garden with the garden hose, I know which plants to water. And I don't go and just water everything. I only plant those that need the water, and those are the ones that were planted most recently. The second thing I do in the fall is go around and I mark down all these plant names on a piece of paper so I have a record of them. There's not a lot of other gardening you can do in the fall, and that's one job that's really nice on sort of a warmish day. You can come out here, mark down the plants, pull the tags out of the ground, because I hate the way tags look in the ground. But I do need to record these plants. My memory is just not good enough to remember all 3,000 plants. Should you deadhead your hydrangea? That's a very common question that I see on the internet, and the person's usually given an answer right away. But the right answer is, what kind of hydrangea are we talking about here? This is my oak leaf hydrangea. This plant makes flower buds on last year's growth, so it's already put on the flower buds for next spring. If I go around cutting things off of this plant in the fall, there's a good chance I'll remove the flowers for next year. For hydrangea that make flower buds late in the year, do not prune them. Leave the flower heads on till spring. This is one of my hydrangea limelight, and it's made huge flower heads this year. Limelight makes buds on this year's growth, so it won't make the buds till next early summer, late spring. You have a couple options with this plant. What I normally do is just leave it alone. I like to watch the flower heads develop into the fall, and they're fine even in winter. But sometimes we get a really heavy snow load, and these heads just hold that snow tight, and then it breaks the stems. So some people will come along in fall and cut the heads off, leave the stem. Then they'll come back in spring and cut the stems to the height they want. Either way works. We don't have to worry about flower buds on this one because they won't be developed till next year. Knowing the type of hydrangea you have is critical for understanding how you grow it. On my blog called gardenfundamentals.com, I have an article that takes you through the process of identifying the type of hydrangea you have. And I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. For those who watch my channel, you know that I grow a lot of things in pots, not for a long term, but I leave them in pots for a little while for specific reasons. I dug up some redbud seedlings a couple weeks ago, and rather than planting them in the garden, I like keeping them in the pots for a year to make sure they're well established and have a good root system. So this is for my own garden, and I'll plant it in the soil in about a year. But for the winter, I'll just sink this pot in the ground so the soil level is up to here, and it'll do fine outside. In other cases, I've dug things up for friends. So I have someone waiting for these two plants. And then I have some over here that will go in the Master Gardener plant sale. I'll treat all of these the same. I'm going to leave them in pots over winter, but they will be sunk in the ground. And once I do that, I don't have to worry about them. They'll be fine in spring. Let's talk about watering plants. I'm here beside my ligularia. It's a nice dark-leafed one. And you can see that the leaves are all droopy. Look at this. This leaf is terrible. It's all falling down. Now, what most people will tell you is that I gotta go and water this right away. But is that really true? Here's how you find out. Take your finger and stick it in the soil. Geez, that soil has a lot of moisture in it. Watering is not going to help this situation. As long as the soil is moist, watering is not a problem. So what's going on here? Well, ligularias have large, thin leaves. Right now, it's early afternoon. The sun's streaming down on the plant. It's quite warm, and the plant just can't get enough moisture through its root system. It's losing water through the leaves faster than it can suck it up through the roots. Doesn't matter how much you water, it's not going to suck up water faster. So watering will not fix this problem. Now, in a couple hours, the sun's going to go around the house here, and this will be in shade. And as soon as it cools down and there's less sun, the problem reverts itself. These leaves will pick up more water. they'll get turgid and they'll look just fine by supper time. This plant does this every day. Now I've tried growing it in a bog garden, which is really wet and full sun, does the same thing. Now this isn't the perfect place for this plant because it's getting sun from about 10 to 4, right when it's really hot out. It's the combination of sun and heat and a limited root system that's causing this problem. If I took this plant and grew it in a bit more shade, or in a spot where it's shaded in the middle of the day, so it's getting morning sun and evening sun, gets the same amount of sun, but it's during a cooler part of the day, it will have less problem with this. So the problem here is really that the plant's in the wrong spot. But it'll grow just fine. It's been here for years. It'll flower just fine. This is really not an issue. Watering is not the solution. This is a newer section of my woodland garden, and the pulmonarias are doing really well. And here's a stinking hellebore. They do well everywhere in the garden. This bed has really great woodland soil. Now I didn't make this soil. It was here when I moved into the garden. This area was covered in shrubs and trees. You couldn't even walk in here, it was so thick. And over the years, those leaves have been falling on the ground and making the soil really good and black. It's a great place to garden. Now you can improve your soil too. And I've written a book called Soil Science for Gardeners. The reason I wrote that book is to help gardeners understand their soil and find the best way to make soil just like this. If you want to grow better plants, focus on the soil. If you get the soil right, you can grow anything. If you're interested in that book, click on the small icon of the book. That will take you to a site with information about the book and ordering information. Gardening in great soil is so much more fun than crappy stuff. Have fun in the garden.